Welcome, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. I should let you know we also have a TV audience in this case. Don't mind the cameras; they'll find you. This is an extraordinary opportunity that one really only gets at Davos, where we have 4 heads of government from literally 4 different continents, 4 corners of the world, and yet they are all grappling with the same crisis, the same problem. And what we're going to try to do is to have a conversation about their perspectives on it and the road ahead. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time introducing them because they are extraordinarily well known. President Calderón is, of course, the President of Mexico, Prime Minister Brown of Great Britain, Prime Minister Han of South Korea, and President Motlanthe is the President of South Africa. Let me start with you, Prime Minister Brown. Where are we in this economic crisis? I think many people here seem a little bit perplexed as to how to think about this in terms of a time frame. Are we in the beginning? Are we at the middle? A famous British Prime Minister once said, "This is not the end, this is not the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning." Are we at least at the end of the beginning?
You know, I think it all depends on the level of international cooperation. It may be trite to say this, but there is no one country that can solve this crisis on its own. And it's a far bigger financial crisis because of how it's developed over the last few months. The word credit is derived from a Latin word, credo, which actually means belief or trust. And this is a crisis not just of credit, it's a crisis of trust in our financial institutions. So the stages of rebuilding that trust and confidence were, first of all, that we had to stop the banks from collapsing, and that was all the effort that was made in October, and about $1 trillion has been spent to recapitalise the banks. There's about $7 trillion in guarantees for the banks. The second stage was the monetary and fiscal stimulus, and so real help given to families and businesses in just about every country in the world is now doing that. But the third step, and the stage we're in now, is the resumption of lending, so that people can actually lend from banks, that banks can assure people that their savings are safe and secure, that householders can get money for mortgages, and that has not happened in the way that we want. So we are taking quite extraordinary measures, so too are other countries considering them, to ensure that the resumption of lending can take place.
Why is it not happening, Prime Minister?
Why is it not happening? Because there is a crisis of trust and confidence in the banking system. It's as simple as that.
But these banks feel they have mountains of so-called toxic assets. What do you do about that? How do you get those off their books?
That's what we're looking at the moment. The capitalisation was the first stage of the process. What you've now got to do is look at how you can isolate the bad assets, but at the same time, while doing so, you've got to find other vehicles by which you can get lending to begin. And there is no model for this, neither in the 1930s nor anything that's happened since the 1940s, where essentially all the crises have been inflation-driven since the 1940s. So we have got to look for new ways of doing things. We've proposed an insurance-based scheme. It's similar to a good bank, bad bank scheme that is being talked about. I think there should be international discussion on what are the best models, but that is the way forward. You've got to isolate the bad assets, but you've got to find a way outside the banking system, if necessary, to see the resumption of lending. And that's why the Bank of England, like the Federal Reserve, is now prepared to buy up assets in the private sector, particularly corporate loans and other means by which we can get lending going in the economy. And that's why we're prepared to consider radical options. The old ways have not worked. We have got to rebuild the financial system. It is a crisis of confidence in the financial system, and it also comes back to issues about values, what values you respect. And I think at this time it's important to say that we reward work, we reward enterprise, we reward effort, we reward responsible risk-taking, but we cannot reward or condone irresponsible risk-taking and excessive risk-taking, which has been what has happened in the past. And so the values that underlie our markets are important as well. We want free markets, but they cannot be value-free markets.
President Calderón, Mexico went through its own pretty wrenching crisis in the early 1990s. What lessons should we learn from that? What would you recommend? You know, the United States is currently trying to decide on this good bank, bad bank issue, to have an aggregator bank, or whether outright nationalization is the right answer. What does Mexico's history tell us?
Well, first, you are right. We, in Latin American countries, suffered in the past several crises. Andrés Velasco, Minister of Chile, was saying last night that we suffered like over 30 crises in 25 years. So we are expert in financial crisis.
Help us, for goodness sakes.
We can do something. For instance, one is, we have lessons. We learn from that. One is absolutely important with a sense of urgency to save or to clean the banking system. We did already 10 years ago in Mexico. It cost like, 15 or 20 points of GDP. But today, our banking system is really sound. The rate of capitalization, capital versus assets in Mexican banking system is over 14%. So it's a really sound system. The second is, Prime Minister is right, you need to do something quickly with bad assets in the banks. Probably the recommendation is doing so, it's important to establish right incentives in order to recover in time, in some years, the real value of those assets. Because if you don't put those incentives, you can lose the value totally. And third is you need to, Prime Minister was talking about risk. You need to allocate risk carefully among the stockholders, among the bankers, the creditors, of course the governments. But again, it's a question of incentives, economic incentives. Another, we need to put in place counter-cyclical policies, fiscal and monetary policies. 10 years ago, we were not able to do so because we were not prepared for that. But today, we have also sound public finances. For instance, our foreign reserves, almost $90 billion, are like 3 times our foreign debt. We covered already all the payments for foreign debt for this year. We went to the market in December and we borrowed $1 billion in the market. So today we are in the different position and we are able to put in place or to implement counter-cyclical policies.
And what you mean by that is public spending.
Yes.
Prime Minister Han, let me ask you your lessons, because I'm struck by a certain irony. During the East Asian crisis, American policymakers, people from the IMF, went to East Asia, and as I recall, they had 3 pieces of advice. They said, you must not prop up your bad banks, because you also had a banking crisis. You must keep interest rates high, and you must not spend a lot of money, because that'll bust the budget. And when confronting our own crisis, the Western world, we have decided to bail out the banks, lower interest rates to 0, and spend vast amounts of money. Were we wrong then, or are we wrong now?
Well, Farid, Korea, as you said, went through financial crisis 1997, 1998. Unlike Latin America, which has gone through many crises, Korea has gone only once. But I think Korea also has become an expert in dealing with financial crisis. As you said, the conditionality offered by the IMF at the time of crisis was very severe. Medicine was very bitter, but we took it. And we took it, to reconstruct, restructure the financial sector and corporate sector. And according to our own experience, whatever measures we take, it has to be fast, decisive, and sufficient. And at the time of crisis, we spent, I think, around 15% of our GNP in restructuring the financial and corporate sector. And in the case of financial sector restructuring, we created bad bank in the name of KAMCO, Korea Asset Management Corporation, which dealt with bad debt or bad non-performing loans from the banking sector and relieved the banking sector of the toxic asset, which was then let M&A and some of the banks were sold to foreign investors. And corporate sector also has to go through a very difficult time. But during this process, I think Korean economy has become much stronger. So year of the financial crisis in 1998, our economic growth was negative 6.9%, something like that. But next year, we have fully recovered to around over 8%. Year after, we also recovered. Our growth rate was over 9%.
But Prime
and
Minister,
we paid back the lending money to IMF 2 years ahead of the schedule.
But Prime Minister, is the lesson there then that Western countries should also take a little bit more pain, that is to force more restructuring? Right now what we're doing is an attempt at a kind of painless recovery, but the government is pouring huge amounts of money in, the Fed is taking on trillions of dollars on its balance sheet. Should we follow our own advice from 96, 97?
I think what you are doing now is also very painful to the people, because if we are spending public money, then that comes from the taxation. Therefore, whatever the government measures to reorganize the financial sector through the public spending, ultimately it will be very painful because people have to pay through taxes.
President Motlanthe, for a while it seemed as though there would be parts of the world that would not be as affected. And I remember maybe 2 months ago you gave a speech in which you said South Africa will not be as affected by this as people think. Do you think now you are bearing the brunt of it just as badly as everyone else?
Well, we are indeed feeling the impact of the declining demand on the global scale. And in the automotive industry, for instance, with the slowdown of motor car sales, our platinum mines are directly affected by that because these are the major customers of our platinum mines. And already we can see the writing on the wall that it may result in downscaling of operations and perhaps eventually job cutbacks. So indeed, we are feeling that impact already. Yeah.
Prime Minister Brown, can I ask you to pick up on the point that Prime Minister Han made about the pain? Right now, governments in the Western world are taking on enormous liabilities and also going to take on enormous debt. Deficits are going to run in the 10 to 15% of GDP range, which is unprecedented, at least not since the Great Depression and the Second World War. How do you unwind all these guarantees that you are making? You're guaranteeing all kinds of commercial paper. How do you get your fiscal house back in order? Isn't there an enormous tax increase down the road in order to pay for all this?
Well, we're perhaps one of the only countries that has actually set out our path back to fiscal sustainability. So we recognise we've got to spend more in the next year or two. I think it's obvious that where markets cannot come in, governments have got to come in. But at the same time, we've set a path back to fiscal sustainability on taxes and on spending for the years to come. So, we have published our path back as well as published the action that we're going to take now. The one point I wanted to take up, because I think this is absolutely central to this discussion, I said at the time of the Asian crisis that I thought the way the IMF dealt with that crisis was wrong. So I'm being absolutely consistent in saying that the better way of dealing with this crisis is the way that the action we're taking now. Korea was able to recover in one sense, I think you would agree, because the rest of the world economy was actually expanding at that time. It wasn't a global financial crisis, it was an Asian financial crisis, and the world was growing at that time. At the moment, every continent is affected. Korea then built up huge reserves, rightly so, because there was no other way of protecting itself. China built up huge reserves, and many other countries built up huge reserves because they thought there was no way of themselves being protected if there was another financial crisis. And a lot of the build-up of reserves is a less productive way of using resources in the world than there need be. And if we had a proper insurance scheme that was international, then I believe that money could be, or a lot of it, could be more productively used. So the situation is different, I believe, because this is global. It's a global financial crisis, now a global economic crisis, and therefore the world cannot sit back and rely on someone else being able to provide the expansion that is necessary. We're all in exactly the same position, and that's why I say we've got to coordinate our action. You see, on the first point of recapitalising banks, it was necessary there was cooperation. On the second point, fiscal and monetary policy, it's really good that people are working together. But on this third point that I say is absolutely essential, the resumption and extension of lending, what we're actually seeing around the world is foreign banks withdrawing from countries and returning to their home base, the amount of capital available in emerging markets declining, developing countries being starved of capital. So you actually need not just people working together, you need real international cooperation to deal with this problem. Otherwise, you're getting a deglobalization of the world economy, which is something that really is not going to help anybody. It will make the recession last longer. So we need that international action, and that's why the G20 meeting is so important.
Prime Minister Han, let's talk about that. You were the, if I'm right, you were president of the UN General Assembly at the time of 9/11.
Yes, yes.
And the UN came together and countries came together and there was a certain amount of action on counterterrorism policy. There was coordination. The UN passed certain resolutions that have been enforced by and large. Is this not a similar crisis? And yet when one looks around the world, what is striking is, as Prime Minister Brown was saying, is there's a lot of countries are pulling back in various ways. Rather than trying to forge some kind of common solution, you have a lot of freelancing, you have a lot of countries worrying about doing things in a way that might actually be a beggar thy neighbor policy.
Well, Farid, now that you mentioned about the United Nations General Assembly, the day I was to be elected was 9/11. Therefore, my election was delayed by one day. First resolution I passed through was a resolution condemning the terrorist attack. I think even now there is a certain amount of close international cooperation to deal with the financial crisis. For example, G20 Summit held in Washington, D.C. last year, to be succeeded by London under the auspices of the British government, is one example where nations will be gathered together to deal with this problem. And I am sure that G20 Summit in April will come out with a very good outcome to be implemented by majors all over the countries in the world, hopefully.
President Calderón, what do you want to see the G20 do? What specifically at this point, what kind of international coordination is the key to get countries out of this economic crisis?
Well, there are a set of technical instructions, if I can say that, to weigh out this crisis. But the problem is, as the Prime Minister was saying, there is a lack of confidence, a lack of trust. So a really strong leadership is required. So the first thing is leadership.
Who should that come from? President Obama?
Of course, Prime Minister Brown, but also President Obama. And that would be a very important difference. Now, the problem started in U.S., it's the epicenter, and the problem coincides with the lack of leadership in that nation. Whatever the reasons were, now there is strong leadership in the United States. And the people need leadership in every single country, and especially in the American society. So this meeting in London will be the opportunity to build and put together leadership among the nations. Second, coordination. I absolutely agree. Counter-cyclical policies, fiscal and monetary policies are crucial, but it's not enough if those policies are not coordinated. Because the effort of one country will be in favor of the neighbor, but we can lose a lot of energy on that. If we have a common crisis in all the world, different from 98, we need the effort of the governments together. So the second is coordination. The third, decisions. For instance, we need to recapitalize not only banking system, but also multilateral institutions.
Like the IMF and the World Bank.
Absolutely. World Bank, IMF, Interdeveloped Bank in Latin America, and so on. Why? We need to redesign them in order to provide more voice to other emerging economies, but also we need to recapitalize them because the inflow of foreign investment to emerging economies, for instance in Latin America, and the foreign credit went down quickly. So the only way to substitute those flows is through multilateral institutions. So we can take in this meeting leadership, which is the most important thing for me. Second, coordination. And third, decisions about several institutions.
President Motlanthe, there has been much elation in Africa about the election of Barack Obama as president. Do you think that he can do something that will bring a greater degree of international coordination together with the United States, the world's largest economy, playing some kind of an active role? What would you like to see?
Well, for starters, he seems to be very keen to interact with other nations as equals. That in itself is a positive element, and I think it would enhance his capabilities of mobilizing all nations behind a common program of ensuring that the global economy is stabilized and that we approach challenges of a global nature in a concerted manner, rather than talking down on other nations and basically using the stick more than the carrot. We think he's a breath of fresh air.
Prime Minister Brown, you've talked a lot about the need for better global governance, but the problem often is that countries don't want to give up their sovereignty and that this gets tangled up. So how can you have a global governance without global supranational bodies that then are resented by people in your country and in mine, the United States? There's a great suspicion of these organizations like the WTO or the EU anyway. Is the answer here to create more of them?
I think people are understanding, as a result perhaps of this financial crisis, that you've got global capital markets, you've got global financial flows, but you've only got national supervisors. And it cannot work when you've got cross-border activities and nobody quite knows what's happening. And then you find in a crisis, of course, that you've got a bank or a financial institution that is international for all its life until it finds itself in crisis. And then the only lifeline is actually national, not international. So I think people are realizing that the international cooperation that we're talking about is essential. You're in a global financial system. How do you ever believe that you could actually solve global financial crises without having a degree of global cooperation? It seems to me absolutely obvious. The problem is that our institutions were built in the 1940s for sheltered economies, for limited competition, for global, national, not global flows of capital. So we've got to rebuild these institutions.
And what would you do? What would be the single most important thing that you would change in this new global architecture?
You see, the International Monetary Fund is acting now in a situation where countries are coming to it because there's been a flight of capital and they can't sustain themselves. So it's acted in Latvia, Hungary, it's acting in Pakistan, it's acting in other countries. But it's too late. We should have a system where you can act earlier, prevent the collapse, and be able to, in this case, recapitalize the banks or at least get lending moving again. So what we're seeing is the withdrawal of foreign banks from countries, the capacity is removed, the country can't take this on itself, it hasn't got the strength to do so. The IMF moves in at the last minute, imposes very tough conditions. It's not going to work. What you've got to do is have a preventative facility that deals with crisis prevention rather than crisis resolution. The World Bank has also got to play its role. The regional development banks have got to play their role. They've got to be more highly capitalized. But just them working together to show that there is international leadership to deal with this crisis will itself be a confidence building measure. I mean, you know the great story that's told about the Chinese president going to God to get advice and asking, when will climate change be solved? And God says, not in your lifetime, perhaps not ever. And he goes away. And then the American president goes and says, when will there be world peace? And God says to him, not now, not this year, not next year, perhaps not in your lifetime. And then the president of Europe goes to God and asks, when will the international financial institutions work? And God cries. And that is the problem, that we haven't got international institutions that are working well enough, even when we're part of a global economy that everybody knows is now global, and should never be anything other than global in the future. And if we don't act, protectionist tendencies will become paramount, and we will have failed in this first stage of building a new global era, which I hope will end with a global economy becoming a truly global society.
Let's talk about that last danger you mentioned, Prime Minister. President Calderón, when one hears all this impressive array of activity, all these governments around the world are going to spend enormous amounts of money, fiscal stimulus. They've all read their John Maynard Keynes. They know what to do. And yet, if you look at these fiscal stimuli, if you look at these various programs, it's a lot of subsidies to industries. It's a lot of what one would have called protectionism. Is the movement toward free trade imperiled by this massive outlay of government support for various national industries?
One of the things that we can do in London is to reject with facts and decision protectionism, because that could be the most dangerous threat to the new situation. We need to learn from the crisis in the 20s and 30s. Protectionism delayed the way out of the crisis. And we can learn from the 98 crisis. Open economies went out quickly from this situation. So we need to be careful about that. In Mexico, for instance, we are reducing even more our tariffs to the half. Last month, we took that decision. And the idea is to open the markets. The idea is to give an opportunity to the market to recover the real economy. And that was my message to the American president in our meeting in January. We need to provide or give an opportunity to the market. We need to integrate in a more competitive way our market. So we need to reject protectionism.
You said this to President Obama?
Yes.
What did he say?
He was agreed that the benefits of trade in terms of job creations, in terms of investment, in terms of upgrading the competitiveness of the region has been and will be very useful for both Mexico and the United States. And we need to work together in order to take care about the protectionism threatness in this particular moment.
How does it look to you, Prime Minister Han? Are you seeing the problems of rising protectionism? President Obama, during the campaign, actually singled out South Korea as a place where American cars couldn't get sold, and that was one of the reasons why he was opposed to the South Korean Free Trade Agreement. You hope that this is going to work out all right?
I think we have to learn a lot from the experience of the 1930s. At the time, nations wanted to protect their own industry, but through so-called beggar thy neighbor policy, but that proved to be very self-defeating. No nations benefited from it. On the contrary, there was contraction of world trade and growth. Now, I think we have to promote trade and investment at this juncture. Otherwise, we will suffer. All of us will suffer. As regards the Korea-U.S. free trade, in the absence of multilateral trade negotiation being successful, the second best is to go for bilateral trade agreement. In that spirit, we have had several successful bilateral trade agreements with other countries, and we have now concluded trade agreement with the United States. It will benefit both countries, and hopefully that during the early part of the Obama administration, we would like to see this trade agreement pass through the House of Representatives as well as Senate.
And signed by the President. You hope to convince him that you are right on this?
Well, I think, of course, President Obama has many priorities at the moment. We fully understand his problems at the moment, but we hope that this free trade agreement to the United States will be also beneficial. This is the largest, I think, beneficial free trade after NAFTA. So we will do our part in passing this trade agreement, but hope that the U.S. will take similar measures through the Congress so that both countries will benefit from this trade. Because according to the estimate that we made, as well as some of the U.S. Research Institute made, both countries will benefit greatly in terms of trade expansion as well as growth.
President Motlanthe, let's talk for a moment about the political, social consequences of this slowdown? Because the world has gone through extraordinary global growth for the last 7 years. There has been a real sense of buoyancy and optimism. 33 countries in Africa in 2007 grew at 4% a year or more. What happens if this is a somewhat longer downturn? What happens to a country like South Africa? You have 23% unemployment, very high crime. Are you worried about the social fabric unraveling in some way?
Well, that remains a constant possibility. However, we believe that we have what it takes to stem the tide of this negative impact, in that we have been selected, fortunately, to host the 2010 FIFA World Cup, and we've invested a great deal into infrastructure development, which is labor intensive, and we hope that we will continue to do so, to invest in bulk infrastructure development in order to at least ensure that the social fabric remains intact. The niggling problem about this whole slowdown is that it is still unclear how long it will and how deep it will be. And that is why it calls for creative responses. We are under no illusion that these interventions are but palliatives, because it is only once we have certainty about the duration and the depth of this slowdown that perhaps everlasting solutions can be found. For starters, I think in order to restore public confidence in the leadership of the world, we should conclude Doha round of negotiations as soon as possible. That would send a very positive message, particularly in the developing world. Yeah.
Fahmy, can I just say that the conversation is suggesting that for the last 10 years people have been coming to Davos, or maybe for longer, and stood up for an open, free trade, flexible, inclusive and sustainable globalization, because that's what I believe most people believe and want to see. And somehow it's all gone wrong. What has actually happened is that we're developing a global economy, we're moving towards a global society. There were problems that we had to solve anyway. One was to have a global financial system without the institutions to make it work. Another is climate change. Another is the resources, oil, and how we use energy for the future. And another is the inequalities that exist, and particularly the poverty in the poorest countries. Now, none of these make me believe any less in an open, free trade, flexible, inclusive and sustainable globalization. What we've actually got to do is show both the imagination and insight to work out answers to problems that, after all, have been created by humans and can be solved by humans. And I think we've got to be far more confident about our ability to deal with these problems. I think we should be far more confident that if there is proper international cooperation, we can actually deal with them. And I think if we proceed on the assumption that everything has gone wrong, we've got a problem here in the global financial system. The banking system failed. It froze up. It's got to be sorted out. There are ways to sort it out that we're talking about. We've got a climate change problem. We can actually deal with it and solve it. We've got a problem about the use of energy. We can solve it. We've got a problem about poverty. That is a problem that can be solved. So rather than losing faith and allowing the protectionists to take over, or returning to an old, antiquated model of laissez-faire and say we can't do anything, we've actually got to grapple with these problems, find a way of internationally working together to do so. And I believe here we should have the confidence that not only can we come through this particular crisis, but we can solve together, by working together, all the other problems that we know exist where international cooperation is absolutely vital.
I think in dealing with the crisis, we mentioned a lot about institutional change, policy changes, and so on. But I think we have to think of the basics. What is the underlying ethical foundation of capitalism or market economy? In this respect, I like to remind you of Max Weber's thesis. that Protestant ethic was a force behind the unplanned, uncoordinated mass action that influenced the development of capitalism. Frugality and thrift has to be the foundation of market economy. But unfortunately, there weren't many people who practiced frugality and thrift until now. I hope that when we have a new architecture, new system, major CEOs would, some of them, practice these very important ethical principles.
It is again another irony, I suppose, that Max Weber wrote about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and he said, as you said, Protestants are thrifty. He actually in that book says Confucians,
yes,
Asians are bad at capitalism. And it now turns out the only ones who save are the Confucians, and the Protestants spend like drunken sailors. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Please ask a question, make sure it is a question, and direct it to one person. There is simply no way within time constraints the panel can answer. Sir, in the middle there. Wait for a microphone if you would, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Arthur Mutambara from Zimbabwe. There has to be a paradigm shift in the way we understand concepts that are based on the nation state.
What is your question?
This is the question.
Okay. I'm waiting for the question mark.
You must be patient. This is Davos. This is Davos. There has to be a paradigm shift in the way we understand concepts rooted on the nation state, national sovereignty, national competitiveness. How are we going to change the way we understand national sovereignty as we move towards global sovereignty? How are we going to change our understanding of country competitiveness as we craft global solutions? Lastly, globalization, the globe, universality, universal. Let's make sure our definition of global includes everyone. Our definition of universal includes everyone. Africans, for example, would want to be part of the crafting and defining of global solutions to the current crisis. To what extent are we incorporating African thinking and African responses to the global crisis? How global is our understanding of globalization?
Good question. President Motlanthe, you are now in the G20. Do you feel you are at the table? Your views are being heard? Do you want more? What would you like?
Well, certainly our views and our voice is being heard, but of course we need also to ensure that these multilateral institutions become representative. At the moment, many developing countries feel that they do not have a voice at all, and that their views are never taken on board. But of course, we must not be too idealistic about the need for a coordinated global management of society's challenges, because we've got to patiently put in place the building blocks, ensure that we build and consolidate democracies across the globe that subscribe to principles of transparency and accountability. That in itself must be manifest in the international bodies that or structures that we establish, because there's no way we can have accountability and transparency in the international structures when we do not practice same in our own countries. Therefore, the two are not mutually exclusive. The progress that is being made in each country will contribute positively towards a better managed global order.
Let's try and get a few more questions in here. Sir,
can I just make one?
I'd like to make on this.
All right. But if everyone makes one point, we'll run out of time. So very brief ones.
Well, surely what we're finding is that the best national interest is found in international cooperation. That you cannot succeed as a nation or even as a region without a degree of international cooperation that has never existed before. And that's why these arguments about sovereignty have got to be taken into account only insofar as we've also got to think about what we can achieve by working together. And I also think what we're finding, as people communicate across the internet and communicate with each other across borders, people find that they share the same values, they share the same global ethic. And these global ethics can underpin the development of our international institutions. You know, whichever religion people support or favour, at the heart of each religion is a sense of community and responsibility to each other. And I think the more we talk to each other, the more we connect with each other, the more we recognise that we can build global institutions that reflect shared values. And again, I think, in the midst of a crisis, we shouldn't retreat from what we really believe, and that is, it is possible to have international cooperation based on shared values that continent to continent we can hold in common.
Prime Minister Han.
Globalization aims at an efficient allocation of global resources, and the efficiency often neglects equity. And therefore, the development finance aspect of the crisis is often not mentioned in most circles. I would like to suggest that we should have a standstill ODA at this juncture when this crisis is being discussed at the international forum.
Sir.
My name is Omura. Currently, I'm working in Japan Bank for International Cooperation. But until last summer, I was executive director representing Japan in ADB. So my question is particularly addressed to Prime Minister Brown about the general capital increase of ADB. I agree with you. Internationally coordinated action is very important. And I also agree with President Calderón. That includes recapitalization of multilateral organization. My question is, with that capital increase of ADB, ADB needs to decrease its operation. And current market circumstance, it makes sense to increase capital of ADB because it's only callable capital. Paid-in ratio is very small, so it doesn't cost money. But
let me ask respectfully that we move.
Yes.
No, sir. Could you give the mic away? Yeah. We would like to move on to somebody. This is too specific a question. It is not, sir, at the back there. I'm sorry.
Ashraf Ghani from Afghanistan. My question is directed towards Prime Minister Brown. The state is back in, but do public servants have the knowledge to guide public policy through this difficult phase? And second, is the leadership in the private sector up to the task of facing competitiveness in this era?
Well, first of all, facing this crisis, all politicians are under huge pressure to define what the public interest really is, and to define the relationship between markets and the public sector. And I think that is the big task moving forward. We've recognised that the old laissez-faire doesn't work, but we've also recognised from our experience of the 1780s and even before that state power is the wrong way of looking at things. So we've got to find a better partnership between government and markets. I don't believe that public servants should be running banks. I don't believe that to be the case. We don't want to own shares in banks longer than is necessary. But we do believe that banking is a strategic sector that has got to work, obviously, in the public interest. And so, over time, I think we'll work out a new relationship between society and banking, recognising that it's not simply one sector, it is a strategic part of the economy. But I don't believe it will include, in the long run, nationalisation of banks or governments holding shares in banks. And I also think right across the world, people are wanting an assurance that we're building our financial system, indeed our economic policy, for the future in each of our countries around clear principles that they can uphold. It is not markets versus not supporting markets. It's not being pro-business against being anti-business. It's really finding the values within the enterprise system that are consonant with what people think makes for a good society. And that's why I emphasize we all want to reward hard work, we all want to reward enterprise, we all want to reward effort, we all want to reward responsible risk-taking, but we've got to be absolutely clear there's a dividing line between that and irresponsibility and excess. And we cannot any longer say that it would be wrong for governments or the public interest to be upheld in situations where people are taking excessive and irresponsible actions for fear that this is wrong, it's wrong for the state to act. We've got to find a way in which the values that we really believe in are upheld by the institutions in our society.
Ma'am, over there.
Li Fen Wang from China Central Television. My question goes to the Prime Minister Gordon Brown. You keep saying that global cooperation is vital under these circumstances. I just want to know what kind of global cooperation you expected. Could you please clarify in detail? And the second question is,
Ma'am, we can't have two questions. And I can tell you, if you ask, Gordon Brown could elaborate this in great detail. And so I'm going to suggest actually that we, President Calderón, when people talk about global cooperation, it all sounds nice. What does it mean? What would the average person understand it to mean? What would change if we were to suddenly see a lot of global cooperation?
Well, the point is, we need that in order to fix the situation. And not only the economic or banking situation, because at the end, all the economy usually is working on cycles. There is no boom forever, and there is no crisis forever. But world cooperation means, well, first the recapitalization and redesign of multilateral institutions that requires money and capital coming from everybody. Second, the principles and values that we are defending. And Mr. Brown talked a little bit about environmental issues, talk about social development. And in order to move ahead these challenges, we need to work together in order to fight extreme poverty in Africa or Latin America, in order to preserve or tackling climate change. We need world cooperation, global cooperation. And that means resources, that means leadership, and that means coordination. And we need that.
Do you see the United States as having been lacking in this area?
I think that I don't want to make judgment about the past, but now is the opportunity for the new government in the United States. And the question about are public servants or private sector ready to face this situation, I think that it requires a lot of courage, a lot of character, if I can say that, leadership. We are not able to choose what kind of conditions will prevail to run an office or to be a president of a nation like Mexico. But we need to think every day what are the principles and values on stake. And I think for businessmen, it's exactly the same questions. And the question is, are we going to face difficult moments or not? That is not the question. We are going to face any kinds of moment. The question is, do you have enough courage to face the challenge or not? And that's a very requesting ask for public and private sectors. And I think in this particular moment, the new president of the United States has the opportunity to show his leadership to the nation and to the world. And in each nation, and let me say in each enterprise, we need to show the same courage. Stop blaming each other or stop to think how bad we are in this Davos meeting. Start thinking what we need to do in order to move on, in order to overcome this crisis. And starting that, we will overcome the crisis.
or as a president says, yes, we can.
Yes,
Gordon Brown.
Well, look, 2008 will be remembered as the year that there was a huge financial crisis, which is as big as anything that has been seen in the world. But let 2009 be remembered as the year where the world came together to deal with the problem. And people look back in the 1930s now, and with limited exceptions, people say that was a decade where people failed to rise to the challenge. In this decade, we have got to rise to the challenge. We've got to rise to the challenge of international cooperation. Look back on the 20s and 30s. Keynes went into the government of the day with plans to fiscal and monetary stimulus for the economy. The Treasury Secretary in Britain wrote on it only 3 words to his plans: inflation, extravagance and bankruptcy, and rejected it out of hand. Churchill then said, we were resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful for impotence. Now, that's how that decade is remembered. We actually have got this huge advantage that we can cooperate with each other. Every continent can actually work together. We understand the problems that are faced by each continent. There is not a lack of knowledge, a lack of communication, a lack of willingness to work together. Now, that is what this year we have got to do. And as I say, there are other big issues in the international community where if we cannot cooperate on dealing with a financial crisis, we'll not be able to cooperate on dealing with the Copenhagen challenge of climate change or any other challenges we face. So let us be absolutely clear. There is an international solution to this. Countries can work together to restore confidence in what has been a failure in the banking system, and we can inject resources into the economy to increase demand so that what we are seeing at the moment is thousands of people in every country of the world losing their jobs, thousands in fear of losing their homes, thousands of businesses going under. We can, yes, your slogan, yes we can do something about it, and we ought to be working together.
Good.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. I think that my summary of the panel is another Churchill quote. How can one not do it? One of the most optimistic speeches in the English language begins by saying, I have nothing to offer you but blood, tears, toil, and sweat. So I think we all have to get to work. Thank you very much.